Hi, my name is Nadia Kim. I'm excited to be part of the BCLA 2020 election mini lecture series. I am going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation, but what I wanted to introduce is the theme, which is that Trump's re-election, as well as his original election in 2016, has relied on bashing of Asia, in particular China, but other East Asian nations in particular, and also by association, the bashing of Asian Americans. So I will be sharing screen and hanging out in the corner. Excuse the streamer, sorry, my children and I were having fun. Okay, so back in 2015, when Trump started his campaign in earnest, and in 2016, you saw a lot of rhetoric about China as cunning, manipulative, and parasitic. And we didn't at the time really acknowledge the importance, the primacy of bashing China, and by extension, those from China, including Chinese Americans, even though we were noticing around the time of COVID-19, the global pandemic, his reliance on the phrase Chinese virus or China virus, instead of simply calling it coronavirus. But I would like to rewind a little bit and revisit some of his China bashing. Now, quickly, the history of US and European bashing of Asia goes all the way back to the wars by Europe against Persia, Alexander the Great's adventures in Asia. We could also talk about the colonization of India by Britain. And so when we talk about Asia, we're talking about many different countries and many different ethno-national groups, ethno-racial groups. So today I'm focusing more on East Asia because that has been the focal point of Trump's re-election strategy, rather than talking about Central Asia, i.e. the Middle East or South Asia or Southeast Asia. Around the 19th century, Edward Said, the infamous scholar, talked about how European novelists and poets figured the Orient and the exotic East as effeminate, irrational, inscrutable, weak, dependent. And this kind of racialized discourse actually buoyed European pursuits and desire for control over the Asian subcontinent and over the coastal ports of China, which helped establish the golden age of Western imperialism. Okay, so what I argue is that if we combine this Orientalist ideology with Americans' construction of the United States as a white country that can bar immigrants from China and other Asian nations, as well as the fact that the United States has had a penchant for blaming other nations for health crises rather than blaming themselves, for example. So the United States and Europe have been the sources, for example, of H1N1 or smallpox, respectively. But of course, it blames other nations, okay? So let's revisit some of the rhetoric. Just to contextualize it for you, since this article was published in 2017, I'm sorry, from the time that Trump started talking about China to this article published in 2017, which was around 11 months into Donald Trump's presidency, he had tweeted over 200 times anti-China rhetoric, okay? So for example, in 2013, before he ran for president this last time, he said, China is the biggest environmental polluter in the world by far. They do nothing to clean up their factories and laugh at our stupidity, okay? Remember his penchant for using the word rape when describing non-whites or non-white countries. So in 2016, he said on China's trade policies, we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world. Trump doesn't like hyperbole, can I tell you? On September 21st, 2011, he made sure to describe China as neither an ally nor a friend, which means that China is an enemy that's just trying to beat us and own our country, okay? Oh, sorry, this is a repetition. Then in 2012, Trump wrote, no surprise that China was caught cheating in the Olympics. That's the Chinese MO. Lie, cheat, and steal in all international dealings, okay? Now down to an interview in 2015, before he got elected. But when you see China, these are fierce people in terms of negotiation. They want to take your throat out. They want to cut you apart, okay? So again, manipulative, cunning, parasitic in the sense that China will do anything to glob on or leech on and steal from you, right? Cheat you, rape you. They're so violent and vile that they will cut your throat out, okay? And so the bashing has not always been limited to China. At a New York City fundraiser in August of 2019, Trump asked the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe if kamikaze pilots were drunk or on drugs. Okay, obviously no inkling that this is quite a racially stereotypic notion. Abe said no, that the pilots were actually patriotic, and Trump said, quote, imagine they get in a plane with half a tank of gas and flying it to steal ships just for the love of their country, unquote. So on the one hand, Trump is painting Japanese people as crazy, insane zealots who would have to be drunk or on drugs to do something patriotic for their country. Never mind the fact that any nation that puts their own citizens in harm's way such that they can be killed are actually doing a similar thing, right? So for example, forcing American soldiers who know nothing of the Vietnamese jungle and fighting, on a territory that's meant for guerrilla warfare. I mean, those are essentially suicide missions. Okay. On the other hand, you can tell from the comment that Trump is very concerned about the possibility that some residents of their nations are actually more patriotic than Americans, right? So he's distinguishing American patriotism from the kinds of Japanese patriotism that he finds kind of crazy, okay? There are other examples as well. I would refer you to an article I wrote for Public Seminar, which is a public intellectual forum. And I have lots of examples there, but some others that I didn't mention in the piece include speaking to a hostage expert and foreign policy expert who happened to be a Korean American woman. And Donald Trump kept asking her, where are you from? And deliberately she kept responding, I'm from Manhattan, I'm from New York. And Donald Trump kept pressing her and saying, no, where are your people from? And so she finally relented because she knew this was a foreignizing, a racializing question. She said, well, my parents are from Korea. And then he talks about in the third person, ogling her and says, why isn't this pretty Korean lady negotiating for North Korea or on behalf of the United States against North Korea? And what this shows is that he does not see her as an American. He refuses to accept her identity and description of herself as an American. And he assumes that she knows anything about North Korea or speaks Korean, and presumes her chosen career for her, which is North Korean, a negotiator. Now, though, the type of Asia bashing and Asian American bashing that we're most familiar with by Trump is him constantly attacking China for the coronavirus, and blaming China as if it intentionally sought to infect its own people, and kill its own people, and willfully infect the entire globe. Never mind the fact that much of coronavirus came through Europe to the United States. He also calls it the Chinese virus, the Kung flu, the China plague. As you can see here, this infamous photograph of him scratching out coronavirus in his written speech to make sure to call it Chinese virus. Okay. And when he came under fire for this as being racist and as subjecting Chinese or any other Asian who could be mistaken for Chinese, and putting them in harm's way, and subjecting them to racist hate crimes, he did tweet in late March of this year, quote, "It is very important that we totally protect our Asian American community in the United States and all around the world. They are amazing people, and the spreading of the virus is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. They are working closely with us to get rid of it. We will prevail together." Okay. He says this on the one hand, right? But then on the other, such as at his Tulsa Reboot rally, the failed Reboot rally, a day after Juneteenth this year, he made sure, knowing full well that attacks against Asian Americans who could be misperceived as Chinese had been underway in earnest, he still made sure at a rally where he was incredibly disappointed upon learning about an hour before that the million RSVPs had been fake or possibly the work of K-pop fans and TikTok users. He made sure to spew, and gleefully spew, might I add, Kung flu at this Reboot rally that he knew an hour before was an utter failure. Okay, in part perhaps because of K-pop fans RSVPing without ever planning on going. Remember that he had set up a stage, a huge stage outside for overflow for thousands of people, where there were literally 27 to 40-ish people I had read. Okay. So the reason why this is important is because it shows that just like the tweets that I showed you earlier, prior to and soon after he was elected about China, and just like his tweet just now where he showed his knowledge that any Chinese-looking Asian American was being attacked, that he did not care, and that it was much more imperative to him to bash China and by extension bash non-white people such as Chinese and other Asian Americans in order for him to not only consolidate his base, but it was to hopefully win over independents or voters that were on the fence, that, you know, are sort of convinced by China's role, not just in taking jobs away and making our economy miserable, but also given COVID-19 and people's sense of threat by COVID-19, you know, fearing for their own lives, fearing for the lives of their loved ones, not being able to get out, not being able to go to yoga and get a haircut, whatever it was, right? Get their nails done. And so he was really capitalizing on white Americans' sense of anger, disaffection about the fear for their lives, or the disruption, at least, to their everyday life, and the ability to just receive services whenever and however they wanted. The reason why the virus is such an important part of his election reelection strategy is because historically, Chinese people in particular have been seen as viruses, okay? So this kind of fits nicely with Orientalism in the sense that when you are depicted as inscrutable, right, irrational, that fits really well with constructing your nation and your people as a virus. So that's why when Chinese Americans were first entering the country in the mid 1800s, they were often subject to these really racist and disproportionate health screenings that were quite invasive, precisely because of fears that they were carrying viruses that, of course, white America doesn't carry, because white America was defined in opposition as purity and health, okay? And so one of the reasons why the 1882 Exclusion Act was passed against the Chinese was based on the notion that immigrants like the Chinese were disproportionately infected, sick, unhealthy, and infecting pure and healthy white America. And that's also why in the 1875 Page Law, even though anyone is equally susceptible to sexually transmitted infections, including white prostitutes and sex workers, Chinese American women were barred through that law because, of course, they must have more of a propensity to carry STIs. Chinatowns were burned, and people living in these Chinatowns were blamed for bubonic plague, for syphilis, for all kinds of viruses that had nothing to do with Chinese people. So Chinatowns were burned in Honolulu, in Orange County, California, just burned to the ground, okay? And so this also coincides with the construction of the yellow peril of Asian nations and Asian Americans, because you're also starting to see not just the increased emergence of Asians in the United States, but you're starting to see this emergence of Asia as becoming more powerful, like Japan, across the world, okay? So this is why at a Reboot rally like in Tulsa, Trump has to use that as a go-to, because he knows that not only is it allowing him to highlight racism and mock Asia and Asian Americans as a way to give him the power that he lacked at this rally, seeing these empty seats. But again, it's in hopes of really trying to stick it to China, because he knows China's watching, stick it to Asia, okay? And by the way, talking about K-pop in Korea, also recall that Trump was enraged that Parasite won the Academy Award for Best Picture. And as a way to counter that, he said, why don't we have winners like Gone with the Wind? Clearly an American movie won, and one of the whitest movies that caricatures Black Americans as mammy stereotypes, for example, that we can find in our canon of cinematography, right? Okay, so he decides 3 days later to repeat Kung Flu more than he did at the Tulsa rally. And this is in front of young conservatives at this conference, okay, in Arizona. One of the other ways he has shown racism against Asian Americans is that he has decided to dehumanize us, objectify us, and without really talking to any Asian American communities or civil rights leaders or movement activists, he treats us like racial placeholders, and he says, Asian Americans are very angry at what China has done to our country and the world. Chinese Americans are the most angry of all. I don't blame them, okay? And so a House candidate in New York, Grace Meng, replied, we are very angry at you. You use racism to disguise your lack of responsiveness and responsibility. And talks about how his words have led to increased discrimination, hate crimes against Asian Americans. And these are some of the examples. So in New York, in spring of 2020, a man, right here you see disguised, was waiting for this Asian woman to come out and throw out her garbage. And when she did, he threw this bottle of acid on her face and her body, and she suffered severe second-degree burns. You have here a Burmese family, so they're not even Chinese American, whose toddler, 2-year-old toddler, was slashed across the face near the eye. The 6-year-old, I couldn't even show this picture because it was so grotesque, but the entire side of the face here was split open and red and bloody. This is the father, who also got slashed. The only reason they didn't die was because of this Sam's Club worker in Texas and this off-duty Border Patrol agent who saved their lives. Now, Jose Gomez was the perpetrator. And one of the important things to note here is that white supremacy is so powerful, these notions of this Chinese virus infecting us, overpowering us, overtaking us, inscrutable, that you have people of color internalizing this as well, and alongside white Americans attacking Asian Americans. So you see this in New York City subways. There have been a lot of videos, a lot of news stories about this New York City subway being a major site of anti-Asian American hatred and racism, violence. Recently, in the middle of July in Brooklyn, New York, you had an elderly woman, 89-year-old Chinese woman, set on fire by these two men. And the only reason she survived was she was able to put her back against the wall and put the fire out. Okay. So all of this to say that in order to understand Trump's original election and his 2020 re-election campaign, we can't understand it without focusing on his anti-Asia, anti-Asian American racism. And different from 2015 and 2016, he's also really focusing his attacks on the Black Lives Matter protesters and on the protests. And that's why his speech at Mount Rushmore and thereafter have really focused on those people are trying to decimate our history, our national pride, and our legacy by toppling, the statues of our most prized founding fathers, etc. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the other lectures in the mini-series. Take care.